Welcome to Dialogues in Afrolatinidad, a podcast dedicated to amplifying and elevating Afro-Latinx histories, cultures, and communities across the Americas and beyond. I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Vasquez. Join us for conversations with experts and artists to learn more about Afrolatinidad. Venga! To celebrate Season 5, we decided to do a little rewind to share some of our favorite episodes from previous years. So whether you're a longtime listener or if it's your first time tuning in, we hope you enjoy this walk down memory lane. And don't forget to join us in the spring for all new episodes. Today, we're taking you back to our very first interview from Season 1 with Dr. Lilly Caldwell. She's a sociocultural anthropologist who focuses on Afro-Latinidad and contemporary Brazil, surrounding issues of race, gender, and health policy. So welcome, Dr. Caldwell, to the show.
Thank you so much, Michelle.
So you have built your career in North Carolina, but you're from Philly. So what was that journey like from there to UNC Chapel Hill? How did you become interested in these experiences of Afro-Latin Americans?
Yes, it really began in my childhood in many ways. Being from Philadelphia, there is a large and historically has been a pretty large Puerto Rican community in Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. And actually, my mother was a bilingual education teacher. She worked with Puerto Rican kids in elementary school. Many of them were kind of circular migrants. They went back and forth between Philly and the island. And so I grew up having some knowledge of Spanish, was really interested in the language. I had a chance to travel to Puerto Rico in high school. When I was a senior in high school, we went for about a week during spring break. And that was very eye-opening. And I think in terms of African diaspora studies, that particular trip sparked my interest in African diaspora studies and the African diaspora because I saw brown-skinned Puerto Rican women who look like women in my family. Exactly. And that just, I think a light bulb went off for me at that point. And then when I got to Princeton, I was pre-med initially. I was interested in going to medical school, but I also was really interested in perfecting my Spanish and learning more about Latin American culture. So I ended up being a Spanish literature and Latin American studies major. I was on the pre-med track. Left that behind, obviously, somewhere in the course of things in college. But I also, when I look back on it, I realized I was attempting to do Afro-Latin American studies. The field was not where it is now. But I remember doing a junior paper because we had to do independent research, a junior paper on Nicolas Guillen's poetry in Cuba, and also my senior thesis, which was mandatory at Princeton, was on New Rican poetry and poetry by Puerto Rican authors. And so, I was really trying to look at the experiences of Afro-Latin Americans without a lot of guidance, but it was something that was of interest to me wherever I could find it. And then actually my sophomore year of college, I heard a Black woman activist and scholar, Joselina da Silva, who's from Rio, speak. And I think another light bulb went off at that point about Brazil specifically, and just realizing based on what she was saying about her organizing with other Black women and Black feminism in Brazil, that there were Black people in Brazil, right? Which often has been neglected when we think about Latin America, surprisingly. And so after that, the following year, my junior year in college, I took a year-long Portuguese course. And then when I got to graduate school at UT Austin, I really focused on Brazil. And that's where I was able to develop expertise really in Brazilian studies and begin to travel there.
That is really amazing. You have just kind of continued this self-education. Like, I'm interested in this. Okay, let me do more. I don't know. No one's really, like as you said, the field was not as fully developed as it is now. So there weren't all these scholars available, materials available, and you took it upon yourself to learn multiple languages, to just, to go to activities on campus, to just really fuel your interests. And that's something that's not always done, that students don't always do. So it's really incredible that it's taken you just continue with the steps to get you to working on Brazil and all of that. I know that you're really passionate about education, especially about marginalized peoples, particularly Black women, as well as issues of gender equity and anti-racism. Can you tell us a bit more about how you were drawn into those? You've given us a little bit of the background, but how did you really kind of start to really dig deep into those spaces?
Sure. I think I've just followed my passions throughout my career. So really realizing that Black women were pretty invisible in terms of what we knew about them, Black Brazilian women in the US, drove me to do research as a doctoral student. And the first place that I was connected with in Brazil during my first trip there back in 1994 was Galedes, Instituto da Mulher Negra, the Black Women's Institute, a Black women's NGO in Brazil, which was founded in 1988. And I would say just throughout my career, I've tried to keep a focus on issues that have been sort of marginalized and communities that have been marginalized, and trying to bring light to those things and use my scholarship to do that. And so I think that's what drives me. And what is enjoyable also is, I think, for grad students or people who are considering academic careers, or even if you're in an academic career, really coming back to your passions will help you stay the course, and help you, I think, also to make a unique contribution, because each of us sees something from our own perspective that other people might not see. And we're able to kind of bring that, in a sense, to the world. And then I would say also with my first book, Negras in Brazil, I was really interested in writing a book for students in many ways, for undergraduate students, because I realized that there was not much published in English about Black women in Brazil, and at that point in Portuguese either, in many ways. And so I wanted to have a book that I could actually use in classes, because when I was teaching my courses, there wasn't much that I could draw upon. So I think really trying to fill gaps and bring more knowledge of Afro-Brazilian experiences, especially Black women's experiences in Brazil, to a US audience in many ways has driven me, but also bringing together an analysis of race and gender, intersectional perspective, has been really important in terms of my work, and a contribution I've really tried to make throughout the various projects that I've been involved with.
And thinking about things along those lines in terms of your contribution for understanding Afro-Brazilian women, Afro-Latin American communities, can you, I guess, give us an example of where you have seen that work, that effort paying off? Has it been with students in the classroom? Has it been in the US, or students in the classroom in Brazil? Has it been with colleagues, other educators? How have you seen your efforts kind of come to fruition?
So I do think that, for example, my first book, Negras in Brazil, has been impactful because it was the first book published in English to focus on Afro-Brazilian women's experiences and activism. And so we've seen this growth. I mean, you and I have both witnessed it. If I could say, we were in graduate school together at UT Austin, right? Yes. And so we know that many years later, Afro-Latin American studies actually exists as a legitimate field, which, yes, some of us were part of launching this field in many ways through our work. And we know it didn't exist when we were undergraduates, or really as graduate students, although there were scholars working in the field, but it has been consolidated so much more. And I think in terms of Afro-Brazilian studies, the field has changed tremendously. There are now, multiple books published, especially by Black women based in the US, that have made gender front and center in terms of how we think about Brazil, that have made race a critical part of the conversation. So it's almost hard to talk about Brazil now or teach about Brazil now without recognizing that there are racial inequalities, that racism exists. And if I think back to the early 1990s, mid 1990s, there was still a debate about racial democracy. But I think at this point, the racial democracy thesis has largely been debunked. Although there are still Brazilians who believe it, there's still some scholars who promote it, but it's just not as common to take that angle and for people to, sort of say that there are no racial problems in Brazil. It's a non-racist society. And then I think there's so much evidence to the contrary, even with the pandemic currently, the coronavirus pandemic, that it's really hard to make that claim that Brazil is a non-racist society. So for me, the payoff is really the publications. You don't know who your work touches in terms of
True.
publications. Seeing the field change over the past 20 years or so has been great. And then definitely with students, with
Mhm.
undergraduate students, which is what I primarily teach, or who I primarily teach, really seeing their perspectives change over the course of the semester,
Mhm.
from anything, you know, it could be anything from us talking about slavery and the fact
Mhm.
that there was slavery outside of the United States, to thinking about the present day and issues like police violence
Mhm.
in Brazil. So I see the most immediate impact and visible impact on my own students, but I can
Mhm.
think about the larger field as well.
No, absolutely. I was just wondering, I know from my own teaching, this often comes up, but do students ever are they often really surprised to hear about the size of the transatlantic slave trade outside of the US? Or do they come to the table with, of course, I've always known that 90% of enslaved Africans went to the Caribbean and Latin America. How are they usually, what's the usual reaction?
Typically, I think most students are surprised.
Hmm.
And I ask this pretty much every semester in any class where I talk about slavery, and there are at least 2 courses where I do that.
Hmm.
Um, and so uh, this semester, some students did say they knew about it before, but maybe not the extent of the
Hmm.
transatlantic slave trade outside of the US. But I do think there's still a perception, which is a misperception, that the United States was the largest player in slavery
Right,
and in the slave trade. But when you look at the numbers, it's more like maybe 300,000 as compared to close to 5 million for Brazil, right? So
right, right.
I think a lot of students are still surprised, and they're still not learning that
Hmm.
prior to college. And then even if they learn it in college, it's almost optional. It's based on whether or not they sign up for particular courses. It's not
Right.
well integrated into the curriculum as a whole.
And as from my understanding of this new book, this new edited collection, that's what you're trying to help educators address. This book, I'll just reiterate it for the listeners. It's called Engaging. Oops, I got the right one. Yes, Engaging the African Diaspora in K through 12 Education, and that was meant to specifically help middle school and high school teachers get at that information.
Exactly, yes. So the goal behind even starting that program back in 2014, the African Diaspora Fellows Program, which led to the book, was me seeing students semester after semester come into my courses and not realize there was even slavery outside of the United States.
Hmm.
And wanting to intervene somehow, and also realizing, as we were saying earlier, that all of this amazing scholarship is being produced by faculty at colleges and universities throughout the world, really.
Hmm.
But it doesn't seem to be reaching middle and high school classrooms.
Right.
And so I was just wondering about that disconnect, and realized that it would be great to start working with teachers. So the book contains chapters on Afro-Latin Americans, Afro-Germans. I wrote a chapter on the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. We have It's just really a wealth of resources, not only chapters written by academic researchers, but also by teachers who
Hmm.
participate in our program, and school administrators, and also archivists. An archivist wrote a chapter, and a librarian.
Hmm.
So we really tried to provide sort of hands-on resources for teachers that they can incorporate into their classrooms.
I mean, that is really fantastic. I know that's been it is difficult sometimes to get at. We because as scholars we kind of have it at our fingertips, but when you're trying to think about material that's appropriate for, middle school and even high school, that is often harder to get at. That is often harder
Yes,
to get at. So thank you so much
absolutely.
for that resource. I know that people are going to really enjoy that. And thinking too about, in addition to the education, what else do you think are some of the most urgent issues for Afro-Latin American communities today, especially as they relate to your work?
But I would say health, and health disparities, and need for more attention to those issues in terms of research and interventions for Afro-Latin Americans, because so often race is not considered and is not part of the data, even the census data,
Hmm.
for many countries. And there is a denial that racism and racial inequalities exist throughout Latin America,
Hmm.
which then
Yes.
has implications for health. I would also say violence, racialized violence, state violence, police violence, violence tied to land issues for Quilombo communities, Maroon communities in Brazil, or Black communities in Brazil, but as well as in places like Colombia, land displacement and the violence involved with that is a real, it's a crisis, really, and we often are not talking about it here in the United States. So we do need to be supporting these Afro-Latin American communities and thinking about the policies, trade policies and so forth that impact them. And also thinking about how we can organize, I think, across these transnational lines and lines of kind of language and linguistic differences as well, and at least stay informed about what's happening in other countries. I mean, in some ways that takes us back to Pan-Africanism, the Pan-African movement, Garveyism, and different efforts to really unite people of African descent across borders. And what does that look like, and what should that look like in the 21st century, I think is really important.
Yes, no, this 21st century moment, it seems like there's so much that we should have learned by now, and we have so much more to learn. But I think that piece about this is not an isolated world, and we should really, work as hard as we can to make those kinds of connections. Thank you for all of this, and for the passionate work that you've done, and that continues to be done. Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and hear more episodes of Dialogues on Afrolatinidad on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. And go to michellereedvasquez.com to check out our episode resources and learn more about the Afro-Latinidad Studies Institute.